So I am moving, literally. When I left Maine, I drove down here for the conferences. I left Maine. So when I arrived at the front of the hotel, and my car looked like the Beverly Hillbillies, and had 2 luggage racks to empty out, because of course, what do we carry with us? Books. At the same time, when I leave here, I'll be going to Pittsburgh. So we'll be in Marlowe's territory at that point. But it's totally appropriate because choosing this topic of Jerusalem, I actually want to touch today on the pilgrimage that begins with Abraham and becomes really part of the Christian foundation. We don't usually think about that. But in America, we are a restless people. So at least for the last decade, having worked on Long Island, going through upstate New York, you go through these areas where you have the foundation of the Mormons, you have the Oneida commune that existed, you have Fruitlands, Brook Farm in Massachusetts. You have all these utopian movements. There's something that happens to the American psyche that we're always on the move. Sometimes for a good reason, sometimes for complete lunacy. Who has ever been to the Oneida commune in upstate New York? Aware of it? It's free sex, return to paradise, the men are married to the women and the women are married to the men, and we initiate teenagers at 15 and 16 by the elders. Wild. But it was the most successful commune in the United States, other than maybe originally the Mormons. That idea, that movement, is part of this whole idea of even the pilgrims coming to the States, well, not the States at the time, but coming to America as a renewal, right? The parting of the seas, crossing the waters, a new creation through the waters. So we have very much this fiber within us of pilgrimage. So what I'd like to talk about today is a bit of what Abraham's vocation was, what Abraham does. So we'll spend a lot of time on that primarily. I told them to wave their arms at 20 minutes and then 20 minutes again because I have way too many pages of notes here. And touching on Moses and Mount Sinai of the covenant, because now we're going to go from the beautiful talk that Rabbi gave, we're going to go 500 years before to the question of faith and justification with Abraham before covenant. Covenant in a different way, but beginning by God's unilateral eruption into this man's life to guide him. Marlo also asked me, I had these magnificent, when I agreed to do this back in the middle of the winter, I didn't know I was moving then. But the whole thing was about do this from a Catholic perspective, which I found delightfully surprising. Because I planned, well, this is going to be kind of a generic think tank conservative group, which is fantastic already. But to say, give it from a Catholic perspective, and then for her to write and say, well, we have Father John coming, who's Orthodox, and so I'm very delighted that the undergrads will have some exposure, perhaps some of them for the first time, to an Eastern vision of Christianity, because I'm a Maronite. And so these people out of, if you remember a few years ago, the earthquakes in Turkey that killed all kinds, thousands of people in Turkey and in northern Syria, that's actually the homelands of Beit Marun. That's where St. Maron was, a hermit living on the mountain in the late 300s, was in those mountains. It's identified with Lebanon now only because Lebanon, the mountains which they had evangelized over the centuries, became the place of refuge. You can roll rocks on people from the mountaintops. And so Kadisha Valley, what we call the Holy Valley, has never been invaded. They've always protected it. It's been a valley called holy because of all the hermits that have lived there over the centuries. The Maronites are also the only church, Catholic church, that has no heterodox version of it. So you have Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholics, and et cetera, all the way down the list. If you're Maronite, you're Catholic, or you're not Maronite. It also has the weird option that it is the only Catholic church named after a man, a bit like Saudi Arabia. So you get a personal name. But that's just as an aside. So I'm hoping that one of the things I wanted to talk about was also the kind of nitty-gritty of Eastern Christianity. Spirituality doesn't work in Eastern Christianity. It is very tangible. It is very incarnate. You all know the famous line from the Gospel of St. John, the Word was made flesh. You don't get much more Semitic than that. And so the notion of veiling, and what is veiling and the putting on of a body, this is also an aspect which I probably won't have much of a time to actually deal with, but leading us then into peregrinatio, pilgrimage. And so when we talk about the transcendent city, the first thing that I want to remove as a vision that we tend to have in America about spirituality, but not religious, is that when we talk about a transcendent vision of Jerusalem, that doesn't mean it is airy-fairy. Someplace that it's a nice idea, it's a poetic, it's pretty, but of a reality that does touch upon, because it is both historical and celestial, it is a sense of coherence for Western civilization in the pursuit of what St. Augustine will call the city of God. And so it's, from this point of view, it's kind of a mess. It's very earthy, it deals with people, it deals with free will, and it deals with a lot of movement. Yesterday at table we were talking about how in the early Middle Ages and the Middle Ages, many of us don't have the understanding of how much people move throughout Europe in this Christian reality. People were always moving. You can't have the Canterbury Tales in the late Middle Ages without the understanding of pilgrimage. Why is everyone constantly moving to shrines and episodes? You have a very famous work called The Way of a Pilgrim, written by Russian Orthodox in the 19th century. Profound book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a profoundly deep work. So, what we're going to touch on today is earthy, concrete, very incarnate, human, and transcendent. So you've all seen Muslims pray. They go down, hands and knees, forehead to the ground. The Christians in the Middle East actually prayed that way first. So as Islam was developing itself and came up out of the Arabian Peninsula, they find all the Aramaic Christians. What are they doing in the churches? You enter into the church, you do metany. So the Maronites, we still do this on the major feasts. We do this on Good Friday in front of the crucifix. You go down on all fours. And someone said, like the Muslims. We said, no, the Muslims are like the Christians. And when the Muslims arrived, those Aramaic Christians didn't see them as being a different religion. They saw them as being heterodox Christians who just denied, they were Unitarians. They denied the divinity of Jesus. It's like, well, we know those people, right? Because the empire kept exiling heterodox people to the eastern frontier. So if you're living in the Middle East, you always had these people being dumped on your doorsteps. And so when the Muslims came up, but that's also a tradition that continued in the West. Because when Dante puts Muhammad in hell, he's in the circle of the schismatics. He doesn't say he's not a Christian. He's not a founder of a religion. And so I say it's messy, it's incarnate, it's very human, and it is constantly transcendent. Because if the people are obsessed by anything, it's by God. If they're haunted by anything, it's a question of grace. And that is so foreign from us in the 21st century. Again, we have to stop and wrap our heads around it. So this human, this intermediate messiness as we try to live our lives day after day and year after year has to be ordered towards the transcendent, which is why you have on the title, as I asked for one, the Transcendent Vision with Intermediate Consequences. So basically what I want to look at, I'll give you an outline because I don't think I'm going to get through it, but we'll get through it. Try to do something. So on the basic notions and why the Syriac fathers will use poetic form when they write their theology. Someone like St. Ephrem is completely aware of syllogistic reasonings of the Greeks and the Romans, but he chooses to write like the prophets in poetry. Much of the Old Testament is poetry. We don't see that because we read it in English translation, but they're poems. And so St. Ephrem is that, because what you're doing is you are trying to say something about the ineffable, which by definition you can't actually say. So then you have to say something on the other side, which is also true, but not completely true. Then you have to say something else about it, which is true, but not completely true. So then on the other side, you have to say something about it also. And you do this poetic, linguistic dance around the ineffable to bring out the image, which becomes, in a sense, the metany. Hands and knees, forehead to the ground, before the ineffable, but now not physically, but linguistically, in a way of vocabulary. Because it also is the idea of incarnation. The question of words are very important for the Syriacs, because God communicates, St. Ephrem will say, by putting on our names. Things that we understand, he will take on to communicate. Second, I also want to touch, it'll come up throughout this talk, on what we call accommodation by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. So now we have a man born in Smyrna who dies around 200 in Lyon. So he's from the east, but in the west. Also gives you an understanding of the peregrinatio of movement of the peoples. But he uses the term of accommodation. He will talk about how God accommodates himself to Adam. And Adam is meant to become accommodated to grace and God's movement within his life. In this understanding, when we talk about pilgrimage, then the conversation has the same value in itself. Same, I can't say equal. It has value in itself, as does the destination. In the Christian modern understanding of Christianity, oftentimes we think about the kingdom or heaven or this aspect as being something that happens after you die. This concrete incarnational aspect of conversation, Abraham's dialogue, it's very incarnate. Abraham is always moving from one place, suffering famines, going through all these different events. This reality in its incarnation has a value in itself, and it's not something that happens just hereafter. So in the Maronite tradition, when someone dies, you say, may they receive joy and light in the fullness of the kingdom. Not in the kingdom, because they're already in the kingdom by their baptism and by their faith. But may they find the fullness now in the dwellings of light and joy. It's a very beautiful aspect. So Kirk, when he speaks about the Greeks, this is a great quotation, that men must be spiritually free. Okay, that's your outline. Now I start jabbering just straight through. So men must be spiritually free before they can cooperate politically on the highest terms. So that's in his chapter on the Greeks. If there's not a spiritual freedom, we talked about this because the discussion panel last night I thought was great, because it was awkward at times. But that's exactly why you come together. You have awkward moments because you're thinking about things. And because of the graciousness by which you approach it, you have wonderful conversations. So I thought last night was great. And Professor Miles did a great job of refereeing and bringing it back, and so it was terrific. But one of the things that stood out, and I was mentioning it to Professor Hansen this morning on the bus, was that one of the things, especially after last night's talk, one of the things when I went back looking at Kirk's book, he doesn't go through any of these cities that he doesn't critique them. He always finds something that's wrong, or something that made them come up short. So this is not an adulation book of, aren't they wonderful, just do what they did. And for the Greeks, he says, they're always fighting. They have these brilliant ideas, they think high thoughts, and then they try to kill each other and commit sodomy and do all the rest of this stuff. And it's like, where are they going? And he says, unless they become disengaged and become spiritually free, they can't operate at the level of the polis. And so the polis, these cities kill each other. All right. So what we want to consider today then is what an aspect of what it might mean to be spiritually free. So we continue a detached aspect that religion brings to the individual, eyes upcast and transcendent, to be able to see more clearly downward. There's a story told of one of the desert fathers when one of the men come to him and ask him for direction, and he says, turn your eyes upward. And you think, well, that's kind of an obvious answer. What he's saying is that you're too tied down to these things below. You can't judge them correctly because your eyes are not actually upward. You may see them in all of their detail around you, but you're blinded by the fact that you're not seeing the larger vision. So raise your eyes upward. So it's a question of vision when we look at this aspect of Jerusalem ultimately. that human freedom in time lies precisely to the degree that the individual is occupied by the transcendent aspects of existence. Be haunted by this reality. This is what created your Western civilization. These individuals were haunted by the divine. If the divine had appeared among us, and as we say it does as Christians, that is a haunting idea. He has sought us first, so what is my life supposed to be but to pursue that reality? So that the eyes then being upcast, we can see more clearly and truly the value of what lies around us. Now, in the late 2nd century, going back to Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, he wrote, Abraham left his own people and became a pilgrim with the Word, so that he might become a fellow citizen with the Word. So the patriarch Abraham sets a standard for the response to a transcendent word. He's an exemplar of the way that both separates and constructs. Remember, Abraham is going to go through 3 separations to be alone to his full vocation. He has to separate. His father will take them north from what is now southern Iraq, takes them up to northern Mesopotamia, Haran, slightly south of the ancient city of Edessa that the Syriacs call Urhoy, which is now southeastern Turkey. And then, after his father dies, a second separation will take him and his nephew Lot and both of their families down to Canaan. Then, when Abraham and Lot separate, you have a third separation, and now it's Abraham, and what we call the promises in that large sense begin. So you have a past aspect, which is separating, but at the same time, using that past, God will speak, I am the God of Mount Sinai, I am the God of your fathers. There is a past, but linking in this idea of Kirk, of past, present, and future, of the unborn and of the dead and of those alive, that reality is seen by this separation, this 3-stage separation, the fulfillment of the promises, because he's going to construct an entire future by being faithful in the present. So when we speak about Jerusalem, let's just get this out of the way. Jerusalem has gone through a motley of vagaries in her history. She has been up and down, smashed, burned, destroyed, everything else. I highly recommend, if you're interested, to read Simon Montefiore's book, Jerusalem, a Biography. Excellent. Reads like a novel. And he just takes you from pre-Christ all the way up to the present day, and will explain a lot to you to the Zionist movements and all this, because Montefiore's family were involved in this movement. So it's fascinating. Well worth a read. But one of the things that we can see clearly throughout its history is that Jerusalem is both on a terrestrial and a celestial plane. It is always an ideal, and it's always a town that people will live in. It's a juncture of communication between the divine and the earthly that has been established as a place. And so for most of the world, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, for most of the population of the world, this rock and dust have a transcendent value as well as a geographical place, which will always be its mystery. So it's said of Jerusalem, and Montefiore says this, that the history of Jerusalem is the history of the world. So it sums it up very well. So it's something that is transcendent, something that is celestial, and it shimmers beyond the geographically locatable city of dust and rock. So at the end of World War I, so this is not ancient history, the end of World War I, it's estimated that Jerusalem in the 17th century probably had about 15,000 people, and even at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it's still relatively small to what we see today. When the British troops come in at the end of World War I, when they come in as part of the war, Lawrence of Arabia makes a very kind of stunning observation of it. He says, this city is filled with political corruption. It's rife with venereal disease. Lawrence of Arabia is saying this. But he still says this location still forces one to bow to the mastering spirit of the place, no matter how bedraggled it may be. It's a bit like visiting the ruins of, not quite the same, but like of Damascus, these ancient cities. They have a spirit to them, but Jerusalem is second to none. So in the minds of most of the world, Jerusalem is the place where God has met man. You have this communication. Now, of course, it has probably the most exceptional name of irony in the history of the world, because while it's debated over the actual meaning historically, whether it's vision of peace or it's abode of peace, peace is in its name. And probably the most upended piece of real estate in the history of the world. So God is already teaching us by the providence, as much as pain and suffering and blood have been spent in this place. Vision of peace is reminding us that our ultimate peace is not here below. This is already the beginning of the notion of peregrinatio, pilgrimage. That the very place where God communicates so fundamentally in the temple, in the crucifixion, this aspect of the reality, that God is already teaching us that it is both terrestrial and celestial by the very name of the place itself. So it is an idea and a principle. It's a source of inspiration and an instruction. It's a story that links us now with the person of Abraham. So when we speak about Jerusalem, I'm taking this in the full sense of the economy of salvation, focusing on Abraham. Because Abraham is a question of a conversation that is broken between Adam in the beginning, who does not listen in the garden, that Abraham listens. He picks up a conversation with God that Abraham had broken. Adam and Eve had broken. Abraham picks up this conversation with God. And so we can identify it as Christians, we identify with this notion of the Malkuto, the kingdom. What we call the kingdom. People are like, what's the kingdom? Is the kingdom the church? Is the kingdom heaven? Is the kingdom grace? Is the kingdom the will of God? And the answer to all of them is yes. It's all of them. The Malkuto is the idea that God's dominion is revealed to us. He manifests His will in order that we respond. He gives grace to elevate us towards Himself when we respond, and He gives grace to have us be able to respond. But the fullness of the kingdom will only come in that future vision in its fullness. So we can give something of a definition, a little basic one. That the kingdom is first of all spiritual. That it consists of the dominion which God exercises over those who hear His word. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. This is barakot. This is that as the angels stand before the hidden one, that we on earth should be like them, reflecting that same glory. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. That in hearing His word, to put it into action, because otherwise it's just spirituality, right? I like the idea. I meet lots of people throughout the last 40 years who like religion. They could tell you all about Catholicism. They could tell you all about Reformed theology. It's a nice hobby. It has nothing to do with their life. They just like it. It's pretty. Of course it's pretty. But that's not the point. And so to put it into action, that ultimately it is a dominion or a regime that's beatified by the vision of God in the fullness. And so when we have this idea then of the peregrinatio, it is to find something here below that is only fulfillable beyond. If you have any questions, you can always scream out. It keeps everybody awake. So finally, in the kingdom, it also has the idea of the social constitution of all those who accept the gospel and keep its laws. And there you come to the notion of the kingdom as it's preached by our Lord, by St. John the Baptist, that the kingdom is among you. The kingdom is at hand. This is beginning now. This aspect that it already begins a social construction and a complete transformation of your relations with one another. It upends everything. Family, economics, politics, everything is upended. And quite wonderfully so. Because if we do believe that there is a wound that runs through humanity and we don't always get it right, the Greek word for sin is missing the mark, that we don't quite get it right, and even the word sin in English is just the old Saxon word for mistake. If we understand that humanity functions in this way, well then we should celebrate that God himself gives us freedom by showing us how to upend all of our mistakes and to put it into a straight ordering. So during her history, the physical domain that we call Jerusalem in the 16th and the 17th century dwindled to as small of a population of estimates of being 8,000 people. Now, I live in a dinky little town in Maine of 15,000. It's considered a city in Maine, but that's still 8,000. That's still half the population we have along the Kennebec River. But the 16th and 17th century, I mean, we all think Crusades, but the 16th and the 17th century, think Pilgrims, think Puritans, think Reform. Jerusalem probably has more of an effect upon people mentally in the 16th and the 17th century when it's probably at one of its smallest population sizes. So again, celestial, terrestrial. So Jerusalem then is a story of mixture, sublimity, confusion, holiness, venality, and heroism. All of it. It just sounds like human beings. It's a principle of faith, it's a source of society's birth, and it's social coherence. And it is a goal that is yet to be achieved. And after our lives, unless the day of judgment starts now, it will still be achievable, to be unachieved again in the next generation. So in the fullest sense, Jerusalem is a thing that is given by God, and all that we can do is dispose ourselves to receive and orient towards that future. So I'm trying to link it into Kirk's idea of what we receive from the past, what we live in the present, and what we actually prepare for those who are yet unborn. All right, we got to move here. Jerusalem, we can kind of lock in with Augustine's idea of the city of God in the way that we're talking about Jerusalem here. How many have read the city of God? It's always one of those questions. Okay, beautiful. All right, great. That takes patience. Good. Try to read everything of St. Augustine. You know, I don't know how this man ever wrote this and then went back and corrected all of his works. It boggles my mind. Now, St. Augustine, we'll talk about the city of God. If we have time, we'll talk about a little bit later on. But for our sake, we can roughly overlap what we're talking about Jerusalem and the city of God as being something not equal, but something very similar. So that Jerusalem is a type of foreshadowing. The city of God is that working of grace, of man moving towards God, as you know. All right. So that the old Jerusalem was built and destroyed many times over. It's an effect of covenant, ultimately. And it's inspired a people to fidelity, has been multiple times betrayed by adulterous idolatry, false images of the divine. But it always stood among men as a sign of greater things promised to come if you just repent. Turn again, look to me, I wait for you. So the city of God ultimately will only be definitively the New Jerusalem in the book of the Apocalypse. The city that has to be given to us from above, that descends, which becomes identified with the wedding of the Lamb. Now in the Syriac tradition, so if you look at the three basic liturgical traditions of Rome, of Constantinople, and then the Syrian tradition, which will be Egypt and Syria and Ethiopia, the Romans always looked to the blood of the Lamb. It's very much emphasized Calvary, our Lord's death, that redemption. Because remember, all the sacramental realities, because you asked to do it from a Catholic perspective, is past, present, and future. You have a past source of the grace, a present application of grace because of what took place in the Christ, and then it orients us towards the future. So you have a breakdown in the liturgical families where the Romans will look towards that past redemptive death on Calvary. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly normal. And that's where their emphasis will be. The Byzantines will take the present reality of Christ, the eternal high priest, here and now at the right hand of the Father in glory. So what do you see? 2.5 hours of brocade vestments and incense and singing. because this is the Christ at the right hand of the Father who presents and who brings Eucharist, and so that you can participate in Eucharist to receive from his sacrifice. The Syrians, what do? They look for the end of the world. None of our Eucharistic prayers, none of our anaphoras go by without saying in the holy, 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 you who have come and you shall come again. That's one place. Another place, always making the reference that you will come to judge, right after the words of institution, that you will come to judge everyone according to their deeds. So it looks to the end of the world. But you know that already because you know Maranatha. Moran is our Lord. Tha means comes. Maranatha, Morantha, literally means our Lord is coming. And St. Paul repeats it. It's in the book of the Apocalypse. You have it ending the last book through all of these things. The Lord is coming. So that's the Semitic version that has been picked up by the people in Aramea. So Abraham. Let us get to our core. So the patriarch Abraham's life is a movement from his idolatrous father. He's the 10th or 11th generation after Noah. So his father chooses to move them north. They move north. They go to Haran. You have other places that give an impression that God also moves. But for all intents and purposes, the family with his father, they move north. Now, this is an exemplar of Russell Kirk's idea that society, then, as we've mentioned, is the spiritual union of the dead, the living, and those yet unborn. To cultivate this union of the past, the present, and the future can only be transcendent because only the transcendent vision can actually bring a time that's already gone, a present that you're living in, and a direction where your life is supposed to be going. So you have to have something overarching. But this reality that unites time can only be incarnate in the present. What you do today, what you did yesterday. He who shall come to judge the living and the dead according to their deeds. Which is going to automatically have an implication upon culture. How do we actually cultivate our lives? What is culture and cult and all of these aspects that are brought together, which are very clearly connected even linguistically? So that's something that must be consciously tended, nurtured by a regard and a respect for the past, along with a wise sense of responsibility towards those who come after us. So just before this conference, I was talking to one of the professors. And a few years back, there was a book that came out, and it was called Generation of Sociopaths. You get one guess who the topic was. Who's the subject of that book? Generation of Sociopaths. Who would it be? Who would it be about? Come on, youngins. The boomers, of course. Now, I'm at the end of the boomers. I'm at the tail end, but I'm still a boomer, and it's been aggravating beyond no description possible throughout my life to watch this mayhem and devastation. So I think sociopath is a very good description overall. Not every boomer is horrible, but you know. You are the poor ones who will live the effects of this. Perhaps I've seen it in Maine a bit more than usual, but the breaking of any kind of cultural and educational foundation has just been devastated. They don't know how to read, they don't know how to write. Apparently they never teach cursive anymore, so I can't even write notes to my parishioners because the kids can't read it. And they tell me, I said, well, go find a big person, they'll read it for you. All right, so when we speak about the knowledge of God on a philosophical level, God is not known directly. It's not a sentiment, it's not a feeling, that's something that happens in your body. You can experience the divine, that's a different question, and we're not even going to go there. But a feeling and sentiment, we only know God indirectly through his effects. But you've done philosophy, so you know this, correct? Right. So our knowledge of the divine on a natural level is going to be indirect. So when we talk about Abraham, there is something happening in the revelations to Abraham that gives him reason to believe this message. but that is not natural from an indirect knowledge that you can have philosophically. In other words, the whole story that is given to us about Abraham is not an idea of a finding of a God that is a philosophical creator of the world, but of a personal interaction, as Rabbi explained so well, of covenant, of this engagement to God and Abraham. So as I mentioned earlier, that this is the restorative conversation. It's the most important thing is the clarification and the reestablishment of the fundamental understanding of the nature of things. This will be elaborated in the Decalogue, in the 10 words on Mount Sinai, which really, when you look at them, what are they fundamentally? They're about the natural law. Don't murder. Don't abuse your speech. Don't lie. Don't destroy your families. Don't commit adultery. You go through them, fundamentally, they actually deal with things that are of the natural law. They have details around them that are given for Shabbat and all of that, but they are fundamentally an attempt to restore humanity already to a natural foundation that then can be elevated by grace transforming. So the conversation with Abraham begins and seeks to restore mankind's vision of an understanding fundamentally of a natural law. That's why your studies in liberal arts and all that are absolutely essential. I'm sure not with this crowd, but with my young people in my parish, you're like, well, you should get this education. I just want STEM. You know the arguments. I want a job. And it's like, okay, that's perfectly valid, but what about your life? So we've had these conversations. Now, in the Syriac tradition, is this okay so far? In the Syriac tradition, we have a liturgical book called the Fenkito. And the Fenkito actually in Syriac means a jewelry box. And it has a collection of all the special masses that are not in all of the other liturgical books. And so it has the image of like your grandmother's jewelry box, right? And it's just filled with stuff. Some of it's magnificent. It's her wedding ring. It's the engagement ring. And then there's like junk costume jewelry in there too. But you don't go through, because it would be like completely disrespectful the day after her death and go, oh, I keep this, that's junk with terrible taste, and you start pulling things out. You have this jewelry box that preserves what your ancestors have given you. And in the Fenkito, we have the office that is used for the Feast of the Apostles. And it begins by talking about, well, who is Israel? Right? Who are these patriarchs? And so the prayer, it's called the Husoyo, it's the incense ceremony, it's the expiation, it's the kaporet, it's the idea of the Holy of Holies, but that's a whole other conference. But it's during the big incense ceremony in which it says, our Lord, our God, in your plan of salvation, you established a people of 12 tribes as truth and as wisdom in the world. And your Son chose 12 apostles as symbols of the fullness and the perfection of the new Israel, your church. So they link this continuity of the story. Page. All right, let's go to Abraham. Following on this notion that philosophically we can only know the divine transcendence indirectly, I do want to touch upon a little bit of a point of why the Syriacs, we talked about this dance around the ineffable. But because it's utterly hidden in itself, it becomes the big argument between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics on whether you can see the light of Tabor, whether you can have some manifestation of the divine. That existence itself, because it is a reflection of the origin, of the Creator, that the knowledge is possible at this level. So that in the Syriac, as we mentioned, St. Ephrem says that God takes on our names in order to communicate intelligently, not because it's fitting to who He is, because it's the only way that we can understand. And this is actually as an application for you in the future. As you study, as you learn, as you go through these things, one of the greatest difficulties you're going to find is how do you communicate the knowledge, the science, the wisdom that you have. Especially because a lot of your peers haven't had the gift of the education or clearly the solid parents that you've had that have given you such a good foundation, which is admirable. You're a credit to your parents. So God makes himself knowable in this way. So we have the notion of transcendence, we have the notion of immanence. And so in the Eastern Syriac writers, they're going to express themselves. So St. Ephrem writes in his 69th hymn on faith. And if you read the hymns of the poetry of St. Ephrem, do them by stanza and then stop. If you just read through them, it's just a blur of imagery, and you have to stop. So in his 69th hymn on faith, he says, in the case of the Godhead, what created being is able to investigate him? For there is a great chasm between him and the Creator. In the case of the Godhead, it is not that he is distant from his possessions, for there exists love between him and creation. Chasm is on our part, not God towards us. So none of those who try to investigate God has ever drawn near to him, yet he is extremely close to those who have discernment, those who can see. So to look at Abraham in the center. Where's my time clock, my arms? Are you waving them yet?
Couple more minutes.
Okay. To 40. Yes, okay. Well, we'll try what we can do here. What are called the promises made to Abraham are central because some of them are directives for his personal life. Some of them are promises that touch his present life and the temporal goods that the man Abraham possesses. And some are directed towards the future. And then some are touching the eternally transcendent. Now, we can't go through the whole thing because it's chapters 11 through 25. If I remember correctly, 22, 20, yes, all the way through his death in chapter 25 of Genesis. We mentioned the first separation, that's chapter 11, the movement to Haran. Chapter 12 is the first promise, second separation, leave this land and to go into Canaan. Go forth out of thy country and thy kindred and out of thy father's house and come into the land that I will show thee. This is after his father's death. And I will make thee a great nation. And I will bless thee and magnify thy name, and thou shalt be blessed, and will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee. And then he makes this, in thee shall all the kindred of the earth be blessed. So he all of a sudden expanded beyond his own life. Now, the reason why this has the impact then of the Irish monks, the English monks, the Saxons, the people who are moving across Europe, is because of this notion of being called to go out to a place. God doesn't tell him where to go. You just go before me. Leave your father's house. The land is unnamed, and the move that is made by Abram has to be by trust. So this is a large sense of faith. And he arrives in Shechem. Now, there's a whole bunch of places where he's moving. Through Cana, he moves farther down south, he goes into the Negev, down the desert in the area, and then ultimately Egypt, back up again. It's constantly in move. In chapter 12, you have the second promise when he's in Shechem. This is now in Canaan. And he says, to thy seed I will give this land. So the land then becomes now a symbol of the divine favor for a people. But as Christians, then we also see an interpretation for all peoples, because we've been told all the kindred of the earth shall be blessed in this. In chapter 12, we have this very unusual interlude about during the famine, Abraham and Sarai, they go down to Egypt. It's a famine, they go down. There's no directives or guidance going on here. They pursue it in a way which is perfectly logical. It's a famine, you go down to find food, tell them you're my sister when you go off. And so it's not directly for us relating necessary, but there's these couple episodes, you have a repetition with this is Abimelech. And so it's a very fascinating aspect that you have two, almost a repetition, which actually many exegetes think is not in its chronological place. I'm not sure about Abimelech, how the rabbis see it. So St. Paul will use this terminology when we do what is logical and what is natural. He will call it fleshly. Doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes it's translated carnal in the older in the older translations. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's according to your nature. And so this chapter here is when they go down to Egypt. It's perfectly normal, perfectly logical. We'll see it again for the wedding, taking his concubine, taking his wife, Hagar, and the birth of Ishmael. Perfectly normal, perfectly logical. There's nothing wrong with what he does. But of course, that's not what God has promised. And he brings in the question of Isaac. Arm waving. Good. Okay, well, we got the part of this.
Time for questions again.
If you've got questions, I know you draw it out.